Hello and welcome. You're watching We Mean Business and we're talking on a very important issue. Temporary staffing or temping is gaining acceptance across industries in India. Companies are recruiting employees on a temporary basis, mainly for a particular project, paying them off and then letting them go as soon as the project may be over. The temps, they work for a client company while being on the rolls of a third party, and there are well over 500,000 workers or even more in the country who are temp workers. An industry that is growing in size and which is now, it seems, here to stay. Today on We Mean Business, we discuss the phenomenon of temping among companies, and we'll be speaking to several very important people on the entire issue. Ashok Reddy, Managing Director and Co-founder at TeamLease. Nadeem Kazim, Director HR and Personnel at Exide Industries. Vikas Shroff, Head Employment and Labour Law at Nishit Desai Associates. Prithvi Shedgil, Chief Human Resources Officer at HCL Technologies, and E. Balaji, Managing Director and CEO at Randstad India. Thank you so much everyone for joining us. Thanks for taking out the time for this very important issue. The first question to Mr. Reddy I'd like to ask you. In the context of what we're seeing in the entire economy, what is driving this phenomenon of temping, and what is it here to stay? How do you see this entire industry?
Temping is always a springboard in good times and a shock absorber in bad times, and in any evolving economy the employment structure is always to have a percentage of employment at the various organization industry end structured around a temporary workforce. So as economies evolve, 3 to 4% of the workforce tends to go into a temp mode. If you look at the Indian workforce and the element of the 500,000 or a little more than that exists today on a temporary basis, it's but a fraction of the opportunity that exists in the Indian context. And I think that's really where the exponential growth and the lever of using temporary workforce for industry, for companies across the country, it has a tremendous potential and opportunity.
Mr. Balaji, what sectors are seeing maximum IT services and IT-enabled services one knows about, but where is it catching up? What is driving this number? And what's your estimate of the kind of numbers that we are seeing right now?
Yeah, I think if you look at the whole industry in India, we estimate about 0.6 million. That's about 600,000 temporary workers are there between organized large established players at this point of time. Sectors which are big consumers of these services, one is the secondary sales workforce, or what you called as the FMCG durable industry is a big consumer of these services. The second largest consumer is the telecom industry, and the third would be the financial services industry. So these three would be some of the biggest sectors at this point of time.
Also from a manufacturing standpoint, since you mentioned some of those industries, telecom of course is services, auto you mentioned, and of course banking and financial services that you mentioned. Where exactly are you seeing in terms of the adoption for that, Mr. Kazim? If your perspective, from your perspective and a manufacturing perspective, how easy is it to get the temp worker, and given the kind of laws that we have in the country, how easy is it to push it in an industry like this?
I look at it from two perspectives. One is temping of blue-collared staff, which is typically happening in the brownfield operations, where people with ITI and diplomas are being taken at an early stage in the organization till the organization forms up its number and also have the requisite experience so that these people can run the plant. So I see this happening in a big way. And secondly, also I see, as far as temping is concerned, more to do in the sales promotion space. Any company which launches products, so they need sales force for the promotions of the product, and also how do we kind of take temping with respect to service technicians, with respect to sales assistants, also data entry operation job, facility management into manufacturing. So there are huge space also in the manufacturing space where I see temping taking shape.
Okay, also get a legal perspective into this. Mr. Shroff, because of the kind of labor laws we have in the country, what are some of the worries that companies have the moment you change the workforce from what is traditionally called permanent workers to the temp workers? What are some of those big issues that come up, and how are we trying to address that?
Possibly the biggest issue from an Indian perspective is the fact that temping arrangements in the Indian context were really meant for activities that were not perennial in nature, largely activities those that were incidental or not core to the establishment. We have a law by the name the Contract Labour Regulation and Abolition Act, which basically governs this kind of an arrangement, and both the principal employer as well as the contractor is required to obtain certain permissions of the Labour Department prior to pursuing this kind of an arrangement. And based on historical facts, the permission is granted by the Labour Department only for those activities that are not core to the organization, and this is the challenge that we are facing in terms of how to have these arrangements legally speaking for core activities of an organization.
From Mr. Shergill, I wanted to understand IT and IT-enabled services industry has generally been known to be very kind, if I may use the word, with the kind of facilities it has been offering to its employees. Is the same kind of facilities offered to both facilities, and I include the term of even the remuneration that the temp employees get, temp workers get, is it the same, or is there some yawning gap between the two kinds of workers?
Thanks for the question. I think the issue around compensation is really around the skill that you are trying to acquire, and in our industry, and I think in most industries today, I think we need to recognize that the appropriate compensation and levels need to be paid for given the demand and supply that you are trying to match. I think temping is really a strategy to either address a capacity issue or an ability issue, and I think it is critical that our industry and anybody who is looking at temping looks at what is the supply and the demand for that skill and pays the right amount. So whether the employment arrangements around that would be influenced by various other factors. How long do you need that skill for? Is it a spike in demand? Is it a long-term need? Is it a capability you're building on a permanent basis? Are you addressing a specific project or program? And I think all those factors then tend to impact what value proposition you offer a person joining as a temp in our industry. So but and everybody looks for equity at the end of the day. Whether as an employee, you do want to make sure that you're being fairly compensated, and that's, I think, the aim of most employers, to ensure that we meet that aspiration.
Mr. Reddy, is this phenomenon largely confined to the relatively lesser skilled employees, or do you have enough examples around the country of people who are more skilled and they want to be temps, they don't want a permanent employment, as we call it, so that they can get better value if they are more skilled?
At this point in time, I think largely the temp workforce is not a lifestyle choice for individuals. And typically the structure of the temp workforce is pyramidal in nature. So the largest volume or the base of the workforce, which is at the entry level, the 0 to 2 years of experience, is what drives the volume. And as you go up the chain in terms of experience or a salary bracket, you do come to a tapering top. So you do have a few CXO level people also who make a lifestyle choice to be temps, but the number is very less. The volume and the industry today is definitely driven by the entry level jobs.
Mr. Shroff, what kind of legal changes do we need from the government? We spoke very briefly in terms of what are some of the challenges, but do the laws desperately need to change now with the new kind of employment opportunities that are cropping up?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the way you look at it, temping has become a reality and it's here to stay. To the extent there is more flexibility given to the industry to allow temping arrangements for core activities, that would obviously be a welcome move. At the same time, the interest of the workers, the employees also need to be protected, and while there are provisions under law guaranteeing equal pay for equal work, the law disallows discrimination to a temp who is doing similar work as compared to a regular full-time employee in terms of wages or conditions of service. So that's a critical perspective to look into, to ensure that there is parity in terms of payment and conditions of service. And one other point is that somewhere we also need to ensure that the temps also get the benefits related to continuity of service, such as gratuity and severance payment, which they may lose out because of the nature of their arrangement that's typically a fixed term contract. So this is, these are the two areas which I believe may need to be looked at to provide more flexibility to the industry to allow such arrangements.
Mr. Kazim, from a manufacturing perspective, how does the differentiation, since it exists on the ground as we are speaking, show up in terms of the way the motivation levels of the employees is seen at the workplace or at the plant?
Whether you have a manpower on temping or whether you have a manpower on permanent role, I think it doesn't make much of the difference, because end of the day you want each employee which you recruit directly or on temping to be an engaged employee for your organization, because only an engaged employee, irrespective of the level he works in the organization, can deliver to the results of the organization. So I think it is extremely important that today, when temping is becoming a way of life in so many services which manufacturing sectors are getting into, I think in no way we can leave out a very critical people who matters a lot to us with respect to the organization performance. Also, I wanted to add one more thing as a dimension. Today large number of organizations in India are looking temping as a precursor for final selection. So it is a good ground to test out the freshers or the MBAs with respect to their skill sets which they have acquired, as to whether they are delivering results. And I think this temping period of a year or two can also be seen as a time when they spend as apprentices on a temping job, and then they can be more employable in an organization. So that's what I have to say on this.
Very interesting point that you mentioned, Mr. Shergill. Show up the same question to you in terms of the worker and the way they go about their work, and also the point that he mentioned about the way it's a ground to prepare you for permanent employment and probably better times, better social mobility.
I think in the technology industry and in the BPO industry, we do work largely on a project basis. It could be a long program, it could be a shorter project, and I think the workforce today is really driven by the kind of work that they do. So I think a contract or a temp or a free agent or a third party a worker, whatever nature of the temp construct that you have comes in, his focus is really to make sure that he is contributing significantly, not just for the aim of the project in our industry or the goals that are set for him, but really to enhance his own professional capability. And I think he or she believes that if he can or she can demonstrate that professional capability, that will translate into possibly a longer term construct, a full-time or permanent nature of employment, or just a longer temp arrangement. And I think that's what really drives them, is the interest to enhance their employability by doing really good work and being part of a technology which is cutting edge or part of work that is new and innovative, and that's what drives that motivation to perform. And they hope to translate that because of that increased skills into either a longer term arrangement or a more permanent sort of relationship, which is what the gentleman earlier was saying. And we see that quite often, and that's really what drives them. I think it is very critical to remember, though, that at the end of the day, these are just ways of bringing people in to do the work, and we need to treat them and engage them and ensure we meet their aspirations, as well, because that is what will motivate them. So it's very important to understand what makes a person actually temp or go in for a temp arrangement. Why is he in that situation? What is he looking for? And not just ignore that and look at that as this person is not going to be in the workforce for a long time. So I think we need progressive organizations need to continue to focus on looking at the value propositions for those individuals with as much attention as we do to people who are with the organization for a longer term as well.
So another issue that crops up, Mr. Balaji, is what is the kind of numbers that you see when you look across industries? What are the kind of numbers who get finally absorbed to the permanent employment? Because there's still a differentiation which is made between the temp worker, and we still end up calling him as a temp worker and a permanent employee. So that differentiation, where does that end, and for what percentage of people roughly would you say that difference ends at some stage?
Yeah, I think in India definitely there is a gap, there is a differentiation when it comes to the salaries given to the temporary workers and permanent workers. Generally speaking, we can see that at least at 20-25% a temp worker is paid lesser in India, unlike in the Western world, where actually temp workers come at a premium. In fact, many studies shows in the Western world temp workers are at least 15% paid more than the permanent workers, but in India we see a reverse situation. So I think cost is one of the reasons why a lot of companies opt for temporary workers. There are also other reasons, but I think to answer to your question, yes, there is a difference, and the gap could be anywhere between 20-25% lower for temporary workers in India.
Mr. Reddy, just wanted to understand from your perspective and your worldview, how much, if you could put a percentage to it, what percentage of workers actually get absorbed to permanent employment, as we call it?
So we have, on an average, a lot of people, as was stated earlier, use the aspect of temping as a stepping stone to permanent employment, and on an average about 22-25% of the temp workforce tends to get absorbed by the company that they've been temped to. Once the trial period and the aspect of the evaluation of the individual is completed, gets absorbed as a permanent employee when the opportunities open up. Another 20-25% of people, by virtue of having built their employability skills and their experience, tend to get other permanent jobs with other companies. So in effect, we are looking at nearly 45-50% of the temp workforce moving on to permanent employment.
Mr. Shroff, from your perspective, also, since we spoke briefly about the changes, the way we need to look at changes in the law, and because there's so much talked about, so much written about the way India's labor laws are, can you give some examples of maybe contradictions in the law which really need to be addressed very, very urgently, so that this industry, which is very fledgling, which is very nascent, can grow and grow rapidly?
Well, the way I look at it, I think there are necessary protections already built into the law when we discuss about temp arrangements. As I said earlier, temp employees are guaranteed equal pay for equal work, but somewhere the way these laws are implemented maybe needs a relook, so that the temps are not deprived of some of the benefits that are already assured to them under law. And if we are able to do that effectively going forward, I believe a lot of concerns from a labor law perspective would be addressed, and that would actually enhance and improve the ability of this particular industry. And as I believe, maybe in a few years down the line, some of the leading staffing services companies may become some of the largest employers in the country.
Okay, also a perspective from the way recent changes have happened. Let's get a perspective on that and just give you an example. Mr. Shergill, if I may toss that question to you. Recent changes in the way service tax rules are implemented, and I just made few points, made a note of a couple of those points there. If I'll read it out to you. Service tax liability is now on an accrual basis, that is, as soon as invoices are raised rather than on collection of, as has been the case till recently. Does that make the work for the HR manager and for the HR department and companies indeed more difficult than what it was before?
I think it creates, it doesn't make it more difficult. I think there is a need to comply with the regulations. I think that the comments earlier that it is important to make sure that we are doing the right thing for the individual, and complying with statutory requirements is just part of the deal for an HR organization today. So I wouldn't say it makes it more difficult. I think it does change the way and just change the things we need to ensure we are focused on. I think the value of that additional effort to do so in terms of being able to acquire a talent pool which we do want to test out, utilize, grow, is well worth the effort.
Mr. Kazim, from your perspective, and again I'd like you to put on the hat for a manufacturing company right now and not just as an HR professional, does that mean okay, looks like we've lost contact with him, but let's get in from the companies that are there which actually help the other companies with some of those staffing solutions. Mr. Reddy, for companies, does that mean added cost in terms, when you're looking at a rather large number, does the recent change in law, one example, of course there's just one example, does this mean added working capital because of the change in law?
Well, I think it puts more discipline on the staffing companies for sure, because the moment we raise invoices, the statutory liability on service tax becomes a reality. So the aspect of not following up for payments or deferring the aspect of collections does put a challenge on working capital. But I think good discipline and good financial discipline for any company is a precursor to success. So it hasn't hurt us very much, and I think all the organized players have come to terms with the reality and structured around the aspect of the invoice cycle with the customer in order to ensure that we adhere to that without a huge impact on our financial flows.
Also wanted to understand, since this you talked about discipline, Mr. Reddy, let me ask Mr. Balaji about how he sees it. Is there enough discipline? And in the name of discipline, because a lot of companies, because of sheer volumes that we are talking about, it may run into hundreds, sometimes also four-figure, 1,000. So Mr. Balaji, does it impose that element? Because there's also an issue of timeline where the relevant government authorities may want that details may be provided within the first week or first 10 days of the month, which really puts a lot of pressure on companies which are looking for temp staffers in a larger number.
One, I think some of the large staffing companies also happen to be some of the largest taxpayers to the government. Many of the companies have been recognized. In fact, Randstad ourselves won an award from the Service Tax Excise Department to be one of the largest contributors to the service tax. Surely, I think some of these things bring in a lot of discipline, a lot of focus. Your systems need to be very strong, because by being a large employers, somebody mentioned some of the staffing companies will become in the future very large employers. For example, Randstad, we employ in India about 60,000 people, so we may be, I would imagine, one of the large employers at this point of time, one of the large employers from a payment to the Provident Fund, contribution to the ESIC, and so on and so forth. By having such a large workforce, we are subjected to regular audits, regular inspections by the various authorities and by the departments. So unless otherwise your systems are robust and you do things in a flawless manner, you can run into severe challenges. And given the nature of the business, you also need to have a reasonably strong financial position to run this business, because globally they say running a good staffing company, it's almost like running a good financial services company. You need to be very careful in managing your working capital, managing your inflow or outflow, because the margins are very thin. So unless otherwise, you have to be very, very strong in your processes and in your discipline.
And that also raises several issues, because there are a whole host of laws to be complied with, Mr. Shroff. Is there a case for, again I get back to the question again, because we are talking of such huge numbers. Already 600,000 was the number that was spoken about for the number of temp workers in the country. Is there a case for maybe loosening the laws a little bit, or maybe making the implementation easier for companies, so that the same information may not be required by different government departments, and the companies may not have to duplicate that and give it to different government departments?
Yes, I would agree with you. Besides relooking at some of the provisions under law, under the applicable laws in relation to allowing temp employees for core activities, there is also a scope of looking at it at from a perspective of whether some of the registrations and the licenses under the Contract Labour Act could be applied and obtained at a national level. Today, as a principal employer and as a contractor, you have to deal with the state government in each state where you are engaging contract labourers. As against that, if just as an example, there could be a national level policy and registrations obtained at a national level, I'm sure it would become much easier both for the principal employer as well as for the staffing services companies that would be operating in different states. So this is just an example. There are also a huge amount of compliances to be undertaken, and somewhere there that also calls for relooking at whether all of these compliances are really necessary in the current game of things.
A very interesting suggestion there for a national level kind of license, because again there are a whole host of state governments to handle, and obviously when a company operates in different states, the regulations may be different in some cases or slightly different, which makes the job more difficult. Mr. Reddy, is there a case or as a company which has such a large number of employees and you provide services to so many companies, is there a case that you've made to the government for that, and any response from the government if you made it, if you presented it to the government?
I think public policy and dealing with the authorities to trying to bring about change in the labor laws, and I think when we talk about labor laws, there's a distinction between how they are written to how they are interpreted to how they are enforced. And I think at this point in time, bringing an alignment on that front is key. So yes, we've made multiple representations for changes in the labor laws, whether it is in terms of how it is written or how it is interpreted or how it is enforced, just to make the ease of temping a smooth process. Because at the end of the day, I think as staffing companies, we provide employment and employment opportunities to individuals. We create an opening corridor that individuals can leverage to building their careers. And a smoothened labor law process would only enhance the element of employment generation rather than restrict it to the element of employment protection that it plays to today.
Mr. Kazim, from your perspective and from someone who looks after HR in a manufacturing company, how could things ease if there was a national level policy and which wanted you to follow one norm rather than different norms for some specific areas in different states?
I think that could be a welcome change if something like that happened. That simplifies the process on a pan-India basis, and it can facilitate how we look at the manning level in the organization. I think that could be a good way to look forward.
Okay, so it seems there is some room or maybe some necessity for a policy like that. Companies which are staffing companies and of course companies which need the staffers, they also would like that. Gentlemen, hold your thoughts. We'll head into a break right now, come back and carry on the discussion. Several other issues related to temping still to be discussed. The issue of skills, the issue of length of employment and several others to be discussed. We come back on We Mean Business in just a bit. Welcome back. You're watching We Mean Business. Today we are talking about the trend of temping or temporary staffing across industry, a phenomenon that is catching on across different sectors. Of course, the early bird movers are there, and now it is spreading across different sectors in the industry, and probably accelerated because of the slowdown that we're seeing as companies need to cut costs and a whole variety of other reasons driving the phenomenon. Let's now move on and carry on the discussion. We'll talk about skills now for companies. Let's go across to Mr. Shergill from HCL Technologies. Mr. Shergill, the skills part of it, what do we typically see from among the large bunch of people who are temporary workers, temp staff as we call them, and when they graduate to higher levels and when they graduate with more skills, do we see them move up rapidly and probably match some of the others that who are in regular employment in the company?
Absolutely. I think we see availability of skills in temps across the pyramid, across a range of skills. The large majority is really at the entry level in the first 2-3 years of a person's career, where people are more open to experiment in this kind of an employment construct to grow their capability, and it varies across. It is available across technologies. I think the outcome as they grow is really a function of how much they have invested in the work that they are doing, how much the company has invested in them to actually grow their skill and not consider them only a resource for that portion of time, but really look at them as a talent pool which can be tapped in case we want to change the employment construct and have the temp actually be a more permanent part of the organization in the long term. And I think the skills that they grow in those first 2-3 years of assignment, as they grow higher up with levels of responsibility, are really a function of the kind of work they do, the kind of investment they make in building their abilities, and the kind of exposure, mentoring, training that companies invest in those individuals so that they can perform at the required levels and become a great pool of talent to look at for future roles at higher levels of responsibility as well.
Mr. Reddy, everyone talks, when you speak to senior level, the CXOs, they talk about the war for talent, and we increasingly, India Inc. is feeling that shortage of talent. But at the lower level that may not be felt because the numbers still are there. at a slightly medium level or the middle level of the management, and whatever numbers for the temp staff that you see, is that difference still existing in terms of the salaries, and do you see that continuing, or the companies are desperate and they're willing to pay more for the right talent that they get, even if it's a temp staffer?
Well, I think one realization for us over the past few years is that the salary difference between a permanent employee and a temporary employee is really coming down. Companies are willing to pay for the skill and the individual's ability on the job, and I think that's the realization that's really come in over the past few years. So I think at the end of the day, what the individual brings to the table in terms of a skill set or in terms of an aptitude or an attitude is really what determines the pay. And also I think realization over the past few years is that the salary compensation structures are an element of fixed and variable. So even if a temp workforce were to perform on a consistent basis, the variable pay would kick in and more or less equalize the aspect of a payout to the full-time employee or a permanent employee.
Mr. Kazim, from whatever we understand and from what we hear Mr. Reddy or Mr. Balaji talk about, there is a difference between the temp worker and the permanent worker or the permanent employee. What is it? I would want to understand from the company perspective, how long do you see that? That's a function of the market, I understand, but do you see that narrowing and probably equaling out sooner rather than later because again of that war for talent issue that we spoke about?
Yeah, see, again I have to reiterate what I said in the beginning of the program is, the word temping and permanent is something which we are using, but from the organization standpoint of view, we are looking at the right skill sets which kinds of deliver results to the organization. Now, temping can be a precursor for taking people on permanent role. Temping could also be a process of creating a bench strength for critical positions where the attrition can be high and whereby the people can come onto a role. And temping can also be seen in an organization for such roles which might continue for a longer duration on a temping mode, and the organization may not like to have that numbers on their permanent payroll because of the very nature of the job which is being done. But I would believe those jobs would be more seasonal, those jobs would be one of its kind, and it could be something which is more related to project based. With respect to salary structure, what I am now beginning to see that the gap in terms of salary is gradually reducing. If you need a good skilled manpower on temping, I think the organization has to pay what the person deserves to be paid, and no longer the organizations are also looking at cheap labor even through temping. So there are salary bands in the organization, and I think depending on what skill sets and what value the individual brings in is the way the organizations are now beginning to look at talent slightly differently. But yes, I would say that it will take another 3-4 years time from now whereby we will see more overlaps taking place.
Mr. Shroff, since there seems to be from all accounts a difference between the salaries, is there a case for the temp worker to make against the companies, or are companies open to being told, and in the legal sense of the term, that they are being differentiated for the same kind of work that the two kinds of employees are doing?
Well, there is already protection under law available to the temps. In fact, as a condition of the license that's issued to the contractor, which is the staffing services company under the Contract Labour Act, the contractor is required to ensure equal pay and equal conditions of service for a temp who is doing similar work as compared to a regular full-time employee of the company. So if you look at it from that perspective, a temp as compared to another employee who possibly end up doing the same or similar kind of work, there really cannot be any difference under law in terms of the pay or in terms of the conditions of service or in terms of certain benefits. And in fact, given this background, a temp arrangement may work out more expensive than a regular full-time arrangement because in a temp arrangement, in addition to payment of salary and benefits to the staffing services company, the client or the principal employer is also required to pay to the service provider the service fees as well as service tax on that. So all of that would make the temp arrangement more expensive as compared to a regular employment arrangement.
That's a very interesting point you mentioned, Mr. Shroff, because if we look at the recent examples of industrial unrest, one of the key issues for the workers has been the difference in salaries between a temp worker and a permanent employee, and that difference sometimes is pretty large. Mr. Reddy, is that one of the factors on the ground, since you're saying there is a difference? Is there a case for tighter regulation there, and maybe not just regulation, even the implementation of the regulation?
Well, I think if you really look at the industrial unrest that you mentioned earlier, is not on account of temporary workforce, it's on account of the differentiation due to informal employment. Most of these people were not eligible for statutory benefits and other coverages as are applicable for temp workforce. So I think we need to make the distinction between informal employment and temporary employment. Temporary employment, while has an element of duration or a tenure to the aspect of employment, does cover the employees for all statutory benefits as are applicable. So I don't think industrial unrest really has cropped up, and the 600,000 that we work with in the organized space have not had any problems till date from an IR perspective. But I think, having said that, the difference in salary crops up because of similar roles. They're not the same roles. The temp workforce is taken for projects or for requirement of a project nature or of a short-term duration nature, and not necessarily of the same job that a permanent workforce is doing. But as they build their skills, they definitely can move into becoming a permanent workforce at the corporate end.
Okay, also from you, Mr. Balaji, I'd like to understand, how do you see this difference? Because ultimately, for the success of the companies, the staffing companies, it is very important that the spirit as well as what the law is, both need to be, they need to go hand in hand, they need to go together.
Yeah, like as the early panelist has said, most of the times I have seen organizations using temporary workers to do jobs which are very distinct, different from what they are asking the permanent employees to do, so that they are able to make that distinction. So that is very clear. And most of the times, whether when Ashok talked about informal employment as a model, I think these are the kind of a workforce which kind of get exploited. They may not even have the minimum wages get paid to them, and many of them may not even get the basic mandatory statutory payments to them. So the endeavor of large staffing companies which are operating in India is to essentially be a responsible employer, provide the workforce with all the necessary things as stipulated by the law, and to kind of ensure that it happens in a trouble-free manner for the various organizations who kind of avail the services of the temporary agencies.
Okay, that's the element of skill, and that's also the element of making sure that there is equal opportunity for the workers there. Let's also get to the length of the job that the temp worker typically does, and which probably will help him in getting the next employment and probably a permanent employment there. Mr. Reddy, from your perch and from your understanding of the industry, how do you see that? Is that the way globally the norm works in the case of the Indian worker, Indian temp worker?
Normally the tenure of the temp workforce is between 3 to 9 months on an average, and what we found is the aspect of conversion to a permanent employment normally happens in the window of a 6 to 8 month period, depending on the corporate's requirement and also the performance track record of the individual. And if we flip it back into the aspect of the other economies, roughly on a temp workforce, that is the tenure that we normally look at.
Mr. Shroff, one contentious issue has been, which we discussed, about whether there is equal treatment for both the employees. In terms of the length of employment, is there an issue there? What should companies keep in mind when they are hiring temp workers in terms of length of employment? Is there a claim that the temp worker can make if he works long term or slightly longer term than the period that Mr. Reddy was talking about?
Yeah, I'm sure we've seen cases where temp workers end up working longer than the length mentioned. And that's definitely a concern if you look at it from a temp employee's perspective. Let's just say, as an example, a temp worker has worked in an organization for 2 years, and then he gets hired on the permanent roles of that same company. From the company's perspective, it might end up being looked at as a new employment arrangement, and the 2 years of service that he's already rendered, where he was not the employee of the company but of the service provider, may get ignored for the purpose of calculation of benefits like gratuity that are linked to continuity of service. So that's obviously a concern from a temp employee's perspective. Obviously, in a situation where a temp employee works for another employer after that 2 years, this is obviously not an issue. But if he continues on the roles of the same company after that period, somewhere we need to ensure that his interests are protected in the sense that he gets recognition for that 2-year period while calculating benefits associated with continuity of service.
Mr. Kazim, what are some of the better practices that companies can emulate for temp workers from across the world, if we can actually learn from some of the experiences overseas?
See, if you look at the best practices with respect to temp workforce globally and what we see is happening in India, I think India with respect to temping is at a very, very early stage. Some organizations have matured to kind of handle the temping with respect to how do you handle while they are still on the roles of leasing companies, and how do you handle them when they come onto your role. How do you also kind of help these people who are coming in tempting roles with respect to right kind of skill sets which they need to acquire so that they are more employable in the organization. I think the question here is, anybody who is coming to the place of work is looking for a career and a long-term sustenance, and I think that is something between the temping and permanency has to be addressed. Nobody would like to be into temping space for lifetime, and I think everybody is looking for a window whereby after acquiring certain skill sets and certain exposure, how does he enriches his career. Today, a good thing which I am seeing happening in India through temping is that people who are freshers are getting exposure to work with larger corporates. They are getting exposed to the best practices. They are acquiring knowledge about the processes, and this is enabling them to become a better employee and get employability in a growth space. So I think these are things which needs to happen more in this country.
Mr. Shergill, final comment from you. What IT and IT-enabled services workers are generally perceived to be more pampered, if I may use the word. Is there still a lot to learn for the temp workers, for the industry?
Absolutely. I think we, one of the biggest changes that is happening in how our workforces are managed globally is a much more focus on segmentation, and we need to recognize that there is a pool of people who are looking for a temp arrangement, possibly many of them as like a string of assignments through their career, There are many who are looking at it as a stepping stone into a more permanent assignment. Across both those areas, I think we need to figure out how to partner with staffing firms who are professional in this space, understand our workforces better, deliver value propositions that they respond to well, so that net their skill continues to grow and they're adding value to the company. I think everybody is making efforts in this area. I think in India we are still we are still in early days, like we all recognize, but I think the IT and ITS industry have more exposure and have more relationships with a variety of these such constructs in many other geographies, and there's lots of learning from how people have started looking at this kind of construct there that we can start applying. And I think over the next couple of years you will see some of the more progressive companies in our industry doing so very, very rapidly.
Okay, gentlemen, we seem to have run out of time completely. Thank you so much for joining us on We Mean Business. Thank you so much, and hope the industry, the temporary employment or the temping industry becomes bigger and grows and becomes, if I may use the word, a permanent and big industry. Thank you so much for joining us on this discussion. That's all the time we have on the show, but do stay with NDTV Profit. All the news and views coming up.